please give a warm welcome to Dr. Eben Alexander.
Okay, well, I really appreciate everyone getting out today to come here. I'm bored to stay out there, so it's very impressive that you're willing to sit inside here for this. And I want to tell you about something that happened to me a little over 3 years ago now. That was, you can see, very obviously life-changing, very powerful experience, and I think something that has lessons really for all of us in kind of a beautiful way. This is one thing that I've come to realize through this whole experience, because I had 20 years in academic neurosurgery, 15 years at Harvard Medical School. Thought I had a very good idea how the brain, the mind, and soul, and spirit, and all those things are hooked together and how it all works. But I can tell you that if you would be a real seeker after truth, it's necessary that at least once in your life you doubt as far as possible all things. And what I have found is that all of that to me made so much sense about the brain and the mind and the soul, I came to realize that our modern science really knows almost nothing about how that works, although the clues are there that help us indicate which direction we should be thinking. Just to kind of briefly make the point, I was deeply involved in the scientific realm, 20 years, had my 9 years of residency training at Duke, and then a total of 17 years, 15 on faculty at Harvard Medical School. And I'm shown in that picture on the far side with the colorful hat and operation, the intraoperative MR unit that we developed with General Electric. I had a lot to do with designing that from the ground up. So I was very much into...
Turn the lights down?
Yeah, let's do turn the lights down. That would be a great idea. Is that my job?
I can't see it.
Well,
Don't speed it up, please.
working with the AE on that project. Not to really dwell on this, my previous life, a lot of time in the idea we can simply reduce systems down to their elements and understand the laws that govern those elements. In the material realm, we can fully explain everything, which part of that in neuroscience is that the brain is absolutely crucial for mind, consciousness, soul, spirit. Once the brain goes, all the rest of the stuff is gone too. And of course, I found out that that's absolutely incorrect. I point out here the primitive notion of God and angels, and a tremendous part of the responsibility here for our misconception also has to do with some of the religious writings. And of course, I will, as you will see, I will have my own difficulties putting things into words, because so much of this cannot be put into human language, that's based in this reality. Likewise with the religious texts and having to talk about a deity and having to talk about a creator and that love and that environment, the words that we use are just very pale, very weak, and do not do justice to what is there. And of course that is part of the problem. But I hope that I can convey some of my own kind of reaction to my experience. I grew up in a religious family. My father had been a combat surgeon in World War II in the Philippines. His spiritual nature is what got him through. He was over there a year and a half. In fact, he was, after recovering from hepatitis, he was headed to Japan to help with the final effort, in which they were anticipating 10 million casualties. So he had a very strong kind of spiritual basis. And I went to a Methodist church growing up in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. Another important thing, as you will see, is that I was adopted, and this ends up playing a role in my understanding of the entire experience. I had spent some of my time growing up looking for my birth mother. There was never a clue from the Children's Home in North Carolina that she was on the other end of the line, and I had given up. Then in 1999, my older son was doing a project in school that had to do with family tree and heritage. And that kind of reignited things to the point where I found out that my birth mother was out there, but it was not a good time to reconnect. And I'll tell you, that really kicked me much harder than I ever knew at the time. And I started having a very serious and complete decline in faith. I no longer believed that there was any answered prayer. There couldn't possibly be a loving deity out there that gave one about anything happening in this little corner of the universe. At best, maybe I could say that I had adopted kind of an Einsteinian view of a creative omniscient power out there, but certainly one that was far too busy running the multiverse to have time for caring about individual souls here on Earth. And that was my attitude, and that's what I had for 8 years leading up to my awakening, to my experience. I'll take you back Monday morning, November 10th, 2008, and my wife and my 10-year-old son and I had been having a bit of a virus over the week, and I felt the night before this that I was getting better. So at 4:30 in the morning when I got up, I actually was feeling things coming back, and I was feeling kind of miserable. At the time I was working up in Charlottesville, so I had to get up and start getting ready. But as soon as I got up, I realized I had very severe back pain, and I had not been one to suffer from back pain much in the past. This was extremely powerful. I thought a warm bath might help, but then I could barely get back out of the tub. Finally made it back to the bed. My wife was kind of rubbing my back. She was very alarmed. She wanted to call 911. I said, no, don't call 911. Trust me, I'm a doctor. It's not so bad. And even at that time, I was starting to go over the edge. Because then my 10-year-old son, Lon, came in and started rubbing my temples because he could see I looked really sick. And when he touched my temples, I felt this spear of pain go shooting right through the front of my head, the worst pain I could imagine. And of course, severe back pain, head pain. I should have figured it out, but I was already going down very fast. And my wife went downstairs to call my colleagues and what should we do. And when she came back upstairs, I was having a grand mal seizure on the bed. I wasn't gone. And in fact, that's the last thing I remember. So a lot of the story of the next 7 days came from other people. And what I can tell you is that as soon as I hit the emergency room, luckily I had a very good doctor there, Dr. Laura Potter. She was pretty quick to figure out that I was extremely sick, and she was shocked that she knew me. She knew me very well, and to see one of her colleagues who'd worked in that ER with her many a time trying to die very quickly was obviously a real shock to her. They were finally able to break the seizures, and I will tell you that I'm very fortunate to be here today. A lot of it I credit to my older son, who at that time was 20 years old, and he had climbed a mountain, 20,000-foot volcano in South America earlier that year. He was training me up, or trying to, so that I could join him and go down and climb that same mountain. And so I was in pretty good shape, and I think that's one of the reasons that I'm standing here to talk about that. It was not such good news for the 6 people who had to hold me down in the emergency room for the lumbar puncture. And when they finally did that, they realized that I had acute bacterial meningitis. I can tell you that in general, bacterial meningitis is much more dangerous than the more common viral meningitis. It's basically 100% fatal. Even if you're treated quickly with the right antibiotics, it's anywhere from 30 to probably 60% fatal. When you come into an emergency room and you've had a rapid course over a few hours down into coma or with a seizure or something, already your chance of getting out of the hospital is down below 10%. Your chance of surviving that. So it's a real bad actor, especially when it comes on extremely fast like mine did. The second day, they got a real big surprise that it turned out that this was E. coli. If you do a literature search, spontaneous E. coli meningitis in adults, you would expect it to occur in about 1 in 10 million per year in the United States. So it's really extremely rare. And I think this has served a very good purpose for me because it's kept me focused to try and really get to the bottom of this and understand what is going on. Initially, I was not responding to antibiotics. And that was very frightening because I had recently been to Israel as part of my work and been to Jerusalem, and it turns out that the worst nightmare for infectious disease of a totally resistant bacterium that had genetically manipulated a common bacterium like E. coli had occurred in Israel when I was over there. And they were worried that this was an example of the outbreak, and that kind of outbreak could be devastating. I mean, rival the Black Plague in terms of devastation. Another thing to kind of keep me focused, the glucose level and the fluid around the brain and spinal cord. Normally it's 60 to 80. Somebody with a bad bacterial meningitis, it might go down to about 20. And during the middle of the week, mine was down to 1. These kind of things really, they certainly got my physician's attention, and I can tell you that as I started to recover, it got my attention, because realizing just how sick I was, I really should not have been able to come back at all. And in fact, by the 6th day, when I really was not showing signs of turning around, it was getting to a point where it was time to start covering. Maybe if this, something doesn't happen here, we're just going to start taking off the antibiotics and talk about where to go from here. But it's not going to be anywhere good. By that time, my survival chances were down to about 2 or 3%, and there was no way that I would do anything other than spend the rest of my life in a nursing home if I was that lucky 2 or 3%. And so that's kind of what my family was facing, and that's what everybody was facing when on the morning of the 7th day, which was a Sunday morning, I started coming back. And I can tell you that this extreme rarity, not only of the etiology, E. coli, but the rarity of my recovery has helped to keep me very focused, not to just kind of let go and say, well, wild and weird things can happen. Because the story I'm about to tell you, if I had heard this from a patient before my coma, I would have said, oh yes, you were extremely sick. You almost died. The dying brain does very strange things, and we had very powerful antibiotics and very powerful mind-altering drugs, and anything can happen. And what I came to realize is maybe anything can happen, but not what happened to me. And I want to tell you what I remembered, and this is kind of the thumbnail sketch. But as you will see, it's still quite elaborate. The first thing I remember is that I existed in what I call the earthworm I view as murky underground. It was kind of reminiscent of, say, being in dirty jello. I have a very vivid memory of these black roots kind of above me. And I was there for a long time. I had absolutely no memory whatsoever of my life. I had no memory of language, words, nothing. No knowledge of humans on Earth. Everything was gone. I was just aware, and it was this murky, dark, brown and red underground, kind of bubbling muck. I don't think my memory formation was working very well because it was just like this constant foam. And given that I'd never existed before that, it seemed to go on for a very long time. If I had to put numbers on it now, I'd say, well, it seemed like months or years, maybe an eternity, I'm not sure, but it was a very, very long time. There was this pounding, monotonous, droning sound that just kind of permeated everything. And if I had a question in my mind, again, there was no language, no words, but just, what is this? There was never any response. There was nothing. Just this great, big, empty, kind of bubbling, foamy, muddy murk. So in a sense, it was very much like being newborn because it was the beginning of my existence. Like I said, it seemed to be endless. And after a very, very long time there was a spinning melody. is this beautiful, bright light, very filamentous and gorgeous spinning melody that just spun up out of nowhere. And it just seemed to expand, and as it did, it was like sunlight in the morning coming into a mist-filled valley. And it just opened up, and I remember kind of coming up out of this dark, murky underground, and there was this beautiful, clear, brilliant, verdant valley that was so luscious. Now, I had no body image. It was actually a speck on a butterfly wing. Beautiful butterfly, absolutely gorgeous. And there were millions of other butterflies flying around, looping and swirling. And we were looping and swirling through flowers that were opening, blossoming, tree buds opening, butterflies looping through, and the most absolutely lovely waterfalls, sparkling water, brilliant clouds. I mean, it was absolutely gorgeous. And the colors, indescribable. Most amazing thing was that it was much more real, much more crisp and vivid, vibrant than being here in this life, in this world now. And there was a beautiful girl beside me on the butterfly wing. She never said a word. She was dressed in what, as I was writing all this up in the weeks after my coma, dressed in what I called a peasant garb. And I could remember the kind of soft pastel and this kind of rough fabric and just everything about her. Beautiful face, beautiful blue eyes, light brown hair, just absolutely gorgeous, and the most comforting, loving thoughts coming from her, because she never said a word, but her thoughts, and again, not words, but pure concepts were coming into my awareness. And as I wrote all this up, much later, the way I translated that, because I can remember all of that so vividly, and the fact that it wasn't words doesn't hinder the memories. In fact, the words kind of dumb down the memories. But the memory was of, you are loved, you are cherished, you will never be thrown away. There's nothing you can do wrong. You are cared for forever and infinitely loved. And I can't tell you how beautiful and comforting that was. And I can still remember her face, absolutely clear as a bell, exactly. And she was there reassuring me. And at that time, I was aware of what I called villagers in my early writing, but I think these were souls dancing below us, all this joy and merriment, dogs jumping, children playing, and lots of joy and dancing and happiness. And again, I'm up on the butterfly wing, and it was so beautiful. And at that moment, there was this divine, warm summer breeze, is how I remember it. It kind of blew through the entire scene. And although none of the elements of what I was seeing and what I described changed, that warm breeze was this first awareness of the divinity of all of this, that there was this divine, loving spirit through every bit of it. And it kind of amplified what the beautiful messages that had come from my companion on the butterfly wing. And after that, out of the universe. It was the most amazing thing to see the entire, just zipping right out to the far edges, and not just of the observable universe, but out beyond higher dimensional space-time until the whole thing was this corrugated ball. Very kind of dense and complex. And I was out there. Initially, I was just aware of this incredibly, indescribably huge, infinite void of black. And yet it was so comforting, so welcoming. And it went far beyond the edges of everything. And yet the higher multiverse was right there. And there was an orb of brilliant light and that sense of that warm, divine, loving presence, of that creative presence, all right there. And they said, again, not in words, concepts, you're going back. There are many things we'll show you, but you're going back. And they would show me these lessons. Parts of the lessons had to do with actually becoming main facets of that higher dimensional multiverse. It was completely outside of anything that we would call our space and time. And in fact, it was very obvious to me from some of these lessons how you could easily get into all different parts of the higher dimensional multiverse and time from out there. So our kind of linear thinking of time that we're stuck with here is very misleading. And the one thing that I had not mentioned in that earlier part, in that gateway, the beautiful valley on the butterfly wing, was that above me were these beautiful orbs of light, kind of arcs of light, silver and gold and sparkling, and these hymns, these anthems coming down from them, beautiful sounds, absolutely indescribably beautiful, coming down. And as I was writing all this up, I was talking about, I thought the best word for that, for those were angels, and that's what I was seeing up there. But the strangest thing in the memories was that this, what I call here the synesthesia, but the fact that the visual and the auditory, everything was all mixed up, and I might be remembering how beautiful the anthems were, but all the memory seemed to be linked mainly to indescribable colors. Or I might be remembering kind of how brilliant and glorious these billowing clouds were up into this crystal sky. And a lot of that was coming to me, visual memories, but as the anthems, all kind of rolled up. And it took me a long time to kind of figure out why all that made sense. But of course, as I told you, I did not have any body image. And then we went, as I said, out into what I called the core. And that was outside of this universe, and there was this very strong feeling that there really were the three of us. And when I say the three of us, I really have to stress that this was not Eben Alexander's little consciousness hanging out in that realm. I mean, this is actually something that all of us know, all of us are part of, and all of us remember. It's kind of buried deeply and hard to uncover, but it is, this was the consciousness where all those boundaries are gone. And we'll talk about a bit of how I've come to interpret all that. And there were many, many lessons, as I said, and they had to do with good and evil. They had to do with the physical structure of the universe. But one of the most amazing and powerful things, and you can bet when I came back and was trying to write this up as a neuroscientific report, very difficult. Now, how am I going to get onto this? The fabric of most of existence is this love. And I wasn't sure exactly how to do it. And I also stressed that unconditional love is, I mean, our human words do not really do justice to what that really means. But it explains so much. And when you think about what unconditional love is, it is so overpowering. And of course, a lot of people will think, well, so you mean like the love that a parent has for a child, I would say. That's a very pale reflection, but you're going in the right direction. And it explains so much about a lot of our religious writings and many other things. But it was the most powerful part of this lesson was how that love was so much a part of everything. And it wasn't as if, oh, there's a battle between good and evil and we're all waiting for the big game and we're going to see who's going to win. It's going to be on network TV. It's not like that at all, because love is the constituent of everything. The evil's there for a purpose, and that has to do with our kind of goal, in fact, of all of existence and what our souls are doing here. And of course, you couldn't have the good without the evil and without the injustice. And that's part of soul school, which is where we are. Of course, other things, love, humor, irony, pathos, all of these in the purest forms in these lessons. And the parts that we would often say are what make us human, how we would differentiate, say, an automaton from a true human. Some of those characteristics were very obvious in that place. It turns out that I was actually, I would be in the midst of these lessons. Like I said, time flow there completely different. And although there's a very real causality out there that has to do with the purpose of our souls, there was this kind of linearity of time and earth time is very strange. It was strange when I was trying to remember this, trying to record this, in the weeks afterward. And what happened was I would find myself back in that earthworm eye view, and I would be back in that murky, dirty jello with the roots above and the droning, pounding. And initially that was very vexing, although initially I thought this is what back is back to. They said I was going back. And then I stumbled on the fact that I could remember the notes of the melody. And by remembering the notes of the melody, it would start spinning. Sometimes it took a lot more work than others, but the melody would spin up and then clear everything away, and I was back on the butterfly wing. My beautiful companion was right there. She hadn't changed at all. I remembered her face so perfectly. And so that happened 3 times that I can remember, where I would come back to the earthworm eye view, and then by remembering that melody, I would go back, and I was always reminded, you're not here to stay. We're going to teach you many lessons. You're not here to stay. And so by about the 4th time, it didn't work. The melody didn't come back. And then it was a long, very difficult trek out of the muck. But one thing that happened was that all evolved into this view of all these people in arcs, and they were all kneeling down. They all had dark capes on. They were kneeling, kind of mumbling, and many of them held candles. And there were actually 2 that I recognized. One was a good neighbor and friend who was an Episcopalian preacher who actually was in the hospital during my week in coma. And I saw him, and I saw his wife in profile. She was never in the room with me. And then I saw thousands of people, and I didn't know any of them. And I don't remember their faces because everybody was kind of hooded. But they were, when I was writing this up, it was obvious to me that they were praying, because what happened, I was billowing up on these beautiful kind of pink vapors that were coming off of all these people around me, and I could hear all that murmuring. My language was still completely shot. I didn't understand any words, could not possibly. And I was billowing up on these clouds, and that was a welcoming back, coming back to this realm. Of course, I had no memory of this realm, but those prayers got through. And I can say that, especially after a long career in neurosurgery, many a time I've seen, I had patients who were very sick, malignant brain tumors, what have you, or bad head trauma, stroke, and their families were wonderful people, and praying and praying and praying, and they didn't come back. And I don't want anybody to think that I came back because of these prayers. I can tell you the prayers help tremendously. They get in, they do a lot of good, whatever direction things are going to go. And so I strongly, when I give these talks to doctors and nurses, and families, I strongly encourage that the prayer really does get in. It's very important, and it gets in when people have crossed over very clearly. At this point, I remembered vividly my companion on the butterfly wing. I remember her face perfectly. And then there were other faces that would come up out of the muck. And my visual memory was actually very good. I could remember them. They would come up, kind of boil around a little bit, and then they'd go back into the murk. And I remembered them. And I really believe that that was occurring for the most part towards the end of that week, because there were people who had been in my IC room in the middle of the week when I was in coma on the ventilator, but completely gone. And I don't remember them at all, not a thing. And the faces I remember, 5 of them were actually there in the ICU as I was starting to come around that Sunday morning. One, a noteworthy example, was a good friend of my wife, Susan Wrenches. She had written a book called Third Eye Open. They had worked together 20 years earlier, my wife and Susan. And her book, Third Eye Open, was about her healing, kind of spiritual healing, and part of it was healing coma patients. And so my wife called her up and told her what was going on to see if she could help, and she said, yes, I'll try. She was at her home in Chapel Hill, and which is about a 2.5-hour drive south of Lynchburg, where I was in the hospital. And so on Thursday and Friday nights in my coma week, she channeled up to me and was right there. I mean, just like these other 5 people who were physically there, I remembered Susan being there. And of course, in the first hours as I was coming around and telling my wife about who had been there, and I said, when Susan was there, My wife said, well, we had her, she channeled here, she came to you, but not physically. She was, and of course I just went, of course. Knew exactly what she was talking about. That, believe me, it was crystal clear. You don't, that is totally outside of physical reality. She didn't need to physically be there. But the face that, there was one other face, and this was really the greatest fear I felt during the entire adventure. And the reason was, so far, I'd shown very little power to control anything that happened here. I didn't know the rules of this realm. I've been shown some very amazing things. And about the only control I had over it was that I remembered that if I could put together the notes of that melody, I could get this, the prayer spinning, or the spinning melody, and it would take me back out into that beautiful realm where I was on the butterfly wings with my companion and then off outside of the universe. And other than that, I had no idea how anything worked, and I thought it doesn't matter. That was my power, that nothing matters. I can go on to exist, full stop, doesn't matter. And then I saw a face I didn't recognize. It was my 10-year-old son, Bon. And he was beside me. That was that Sunday morning. I was still on the ventilator, had the breathing tube in, and was still whacked out. My eyes were one over there, one over here. My brainstem had taken a hit. I was deep. And he was there saying, "Daddy, you're going to be okay, Daddy." And this is just after that conversation he'd overheard. They protected him most of the week. But he had heard that they were talking about starting to back down on care. And he knew what all that meant. He'd heard enough. Even though he'd been protected, he'd heard enough. So he was kissing me and rubbing me. "Daddy, you're going to be okay. Daddy, you're going to be okay." And somehow that triggered something inside of me. I went, oh, no. Because then I realized it's not just me. This really matters. There's somebody else out there. And it was by far the most terrifying thing in this experience, because now everything mattered. I didn't understand a thing, but I had to somehow start getting a grip on it. And that was absolutely frightening. And I was just beginning to kind of come back. Just beginning. My cortex was healing enough that I was starting to see people around me in the ICU, and my language started coming back very rapidly over the next few hours. I had no memory of my family, but that also started coming back very quickly. And kind of interspersed in here was something very interesting that initially I just kind of chalked up to, oh, well, when you're that sick, anything can happen. But it's been very helpful in sorting out what really did happen. And that is, it's what I call the nightmare, and I'm not going to go into huge detail on it, except to make a few brief points. It was very kind of real. When I was in college at UNC Chapel Hill, I used to jump out of airplanes. I spent about 3.5 hours of my life in free fall. We'd build big formations, we'd jump at night, jump in the water, big group formations. It was tremendous fun. And I used to have a lot of dreams, even after I stopped jumping, after college was over, that were very vivid. They were so vivid I would often go, well, when's the last time I really jumped? So anyway, in this, what I call the nightmare, which was in and out over the 24 hours that I was first waking up, skydiving was part of it. It was the only good part. Everything else was very bad. I was a cancer patient in South Florida in this huge 3-towered cancer unit. Top tower was 60 stories high. It was well known as a place where people with cancer would commit suicide. They jump off. It's a beautiful scene up there. I remember going up there, and I was very paranoid because in this kind of nightmarish scenario, I saw my wife. She was with 2 Florida police officers. They said I really screwed up this time, and this was it. I didn't have any more outs. And they forced me out a door at the 60th story. And I remember how beautiful it was. The sun was coming up over the Caribbean, and just a beautiful sparkling water down there, 60 floors down. And as I started falling, because when they shut the door, there was nothing left to stand on, and I started falling, and I realized I wasn't falling. I was on a cable. and I could hear the pulleys whirring up above, and there was this woman, a ninja, right beside me. And she was snapping pictures with her Nikon camera, and I had these kind of stroboscopic views of myself tumbling, the silhouette tumbling, but I knew I wasn't going to die. She had rescued me. Then I saw her boyfriend, another ninja, on his way up. He was the counterweight, the other end of the cable, kind of zipping by, and then she lowered me down. She explained, we did this to make money for taking pictures. We knew people would make suicide leaps off here. We're doing this for a magazine. Then we hit the grass. I remember lying in the grass. I could see the rising sun refracted through the dewdrops in the grass. It was just beautiful, and thinking, I am alive. And it was the most beautiful, wonderful thing, because I really felt a lot of fear. Now, some things to notice here. I had tons of language. My language was already back online. I mean, this was a psychotic, ICU, psychosis, sleep deprivation nightmare. It was crazy. It was a little more real than my normal dreaming, but it was crazy, and it really led nowhere. It was kind of nonsensical. Although people who interpret dreams can give me all kinds of feedback on what it tells me about defects in my character. But anyway, the stunning thing was that beautiful gateway deep inside on the butterfly wing with my guardian angel, as I came to call her, and outside of the universe, and all that crisp hyper-reality there was totally different. Absolutely different. Much more real. Made tremendous sense. I mean, there was this storyline that stretched across all my visits there, like we're making these points for a reason, as compared to the psychotic, crazy nightmare that I've seen myself, as a physician with people in ICUs. And it was very helpful in explaining all of what transpired. Now, when I first started waking up that Sunday, like I said, I was crazy as a bedbug for a few days, and then started to kind of mellow out. I can credit my wonderful sisters, Betsy and Phyllis. They did yeoman's work, spending nights with me in the ICU. I was nuts, and I remember counting up when the doctors came in on rounds and said, I have been awake every second for the last 10 days and nights. You've got to give me something to help me sleep. You got to take this internet off the ceiling. There was all this crazy stuff going on because my brain was coming back, and it was a sick brain. But it was totally different from what had happened deep inside. And that, as my neurosurgical and neuroscientific training came back over the coming weeks, which probably took about 3 or 4 weeks for me to get, I think, everything back. I was absolutely shocked and buffeted by, what is going on here. And of course, that was just the beginning, because I had kind of vowed to my son, who was majoring in neuroscience at the time, my older son. He came home the second day I was out of the hospital. It was 2 days before Thanksgiving. And he could see I was serious about writing all this up, and he said, well, if you're really serious about something useful, 2 pieces of advice. 1, don't read anything until you've written down the whole story. And of course, I was like, I couldn't wait to read everything I could get my hands on about near-death experiences, but he was right, so I didn't. And I ended up typing about 60 pages single-spaced in my computer over the next 6 weeks before I started reading anything about near-death experiences. He also said, don't talk with anyone who was there, because he could tell I was trying to ask people to corroborate the story. Did I ever do something like this or look like that? And so I just shut up. I didn't talk to anybody. And I wrote down everything I could remember. If you would ask me before my coma, how much does somebody remember when their CSF glucose is 1, they got bacterial meningitis, and they're almost certain to die, and they come out of it? I'd say, well, obviously nothing. And I would have been very wrong, because I remembered a tremendous amount. Putting it to words was sometimes difficult, but the memories were very sharp, and interestingly enough, are still very sharp. I mean, those memories don't fade, and that tells me something that's fairly interesting about memory, mind, brain, spirit, and everything else too, because we have lots of memories that are not dependent on the physical pathways in the brain that we think of as being part of memory. Now, I've already kind of been through some of these points. It was stunning to me the difference between that deep spiritual realm inside of coma and that earthworm eye view, the kind of poor ugly, and also that nightmare. So they were very helpful in figuring out what was going on. Now, one thing I think is very important, because I wouldn't be standing here if I'd been in a coma for some other reason. If I'd had a hemorrhage in my brain, or head trauma, or any number of things that will put people into coma. Meningitis is actually a really great model of human death, and the reason is the part of our brains that makes us human is that whole outer surface. And none of the deep stuff makes us human. The deep stuff is all older and more primitive animals, but it's that robust expression of the neocortex, that outer surface. That's the part that makes us human. And a very extremely severe case of meningitis is a great way to mimic human death, because it gets rid of all the pieces that could pull together any kind of rich experience. That's all out here. I mean, visual, auditory, any kind of understanding of kind of position, environment, all those things we think of in neuroscience, that all happens out in that cortex. And my meningitis was plenty severe to wipe that out, make it non-functional. And I was completely shocked how there was that juxtaposition deep inside, where the earthworm eye view with a spinning melody would all of a sudden yield this hyper-real, hyper-complex existence that was so totally meaningful. And that was very helpful at my trying to understand this. So one thing that I certainly, a concept I want to put out there for you, and again, this took me a long time. This took me more than a year to get to this point. As a neuroscientist, practicing neurosurgeon who had spent all this time thinking he understood the brain and mind, I will tell you that we are conscious in spite of our brain. And of course, to some people that's like, you know, have you really lost it or what? But in fact, we can have very, very vivid experience, and I had wonderful evidence of that. And yet, the real shocker was as I started to read the near-death experience literature, I realized millions of people have been through the same thing. And of course, their doctors would always say, oh, you were very sick. Oh, and we had you on very powerful drugs. So anything can happen. But I can tell you this could not happen. And that was the part that really got my attention in a very major way, because I came to conclude that out-of-body consciousness, awareness, completely independent of the brain and of physical reality, is a fact. It's very real. And the NDE world is full of it. And of course, there are extensions of that into what I call extended consciousness that kind of go way beyond that. I want to talk about a few things that were still bothering me. I was out reading all the near-death experience literature, and of course becoming very familiar with the commonalities in my case and other cases, but there were some differences. My father had passed on 4 years before all this, and he was nowhere to be seen. I mean, absolutely not. If I had scripted this, he would have been there front and center. He was the one I wanted to talk to, I wanted to interact with, make a few amends. There were things that I'd always wanted to say and never did, and he wasn't there. He was nowhere. And that was a real problem for me. And in fact, I started doubting whether I'd had an authentic near-death experience or spiritual experience at all, even though it was extremely powerful, hyper-reality. But why wasn't he there? And my companion on the butterfly wing, I could remember her face perfectly. I knew her so well that I knew never in my life had I met that person. And that part was how in the world do you explain that? And for me, it really, you know, these were really deal breakers. I didn't know where to go with this. And this was in, you know, 3 and 4 months after my coma. And to kind of explain the revelations that happened about 4 months out, I want to take you back a little bit. And remember, I said that I was adopted. I was put up for adoption when I was 2 weeks old. I was adopted at 4 months. And in 2000, my son had been working on a school project, and he wanted to know about the biological heritage, and in fact, I had contacted Children's Home in North Carolina, and then I remembered I was driving with my son in February of 2000. We were going up skiing in Maine. Oh gosh, I got to call Betty. She said she might have some information by now. So I called her up on the cell phone. We were driving through a blizzard at the time. And she said, why, yes, I did find something out. And of course, I didn't know what in the world do I make of that. She said, are you sitting down? And I thought, well, yeah, I'm sitting down. I'm driving through a blizzard, but that qualified. And she said, your parents got married. And I can't tell you what a shock that was. I had known that my mother was a sophomore in high school, my father was a senior in high school, and all the information I had from the Children's Home in 1954 said they went their separate ways, and that was that. But they got married. And there's more. They had 3 children. And of course, this was really, by this time I had pulled over. And I can't tell you what was going through my mind. And she said, but your youngest sister died 2 years ago. And it's not a good time for you to come back in their lives. And as I said earlier, that was the beginning. I didn't recognize it. I was just like, you know, but I stuffed it. My son was sitting in the back seat. His eyes were wide open. But he didn't know what had happened. Something big had happened. But I didn't say a word. We drove all the way up, you know, half an hour up to Sunday River to go skiing. I never said a word. And he remembers that very vividly to this day. And it was the end of my believing in prayer. And a lot of things in my life started to kind of tumble and fall apart. And I didn't know why. It's just bad luck. You know, things don't work out. You know, things were really going down. 7 years later, walking on the beach with 2 of my 3 sisters, they said, well, don't you think it's time you went back to find your birth family? And I went, I guess. I didn't, you know, I wasn't sure, but they were right. It was time to reach out again, so I did. And this time I got a very positive response. Yes, we would love to meet you, and it was all kind of set up, and the laws were relaxing, which allowed the Children's Home people to help out. And so I met them October 5th, 2007, and that, you know, that old saying, walking on air, I felt that 3 times in my life. The 2 times my sons were born, and then the time I was walking up to meet my parents. And it was so beautiful, and it has been ever since, meeting them, meeting my siblings, their families. Everything about it has been just absolutely wonderful. There was always this little kind of bittersweet component, because every now and then they'd mention a little bit about Betsy. Every now and then I might see a little picture of her or something. They wouldn't dwell on it. They didn't like talking about her. And then as I was reading all this near-death stuff 4 months out, I was reading in Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's book about this teenage girl who had an operation, was in a coma, near-death experience. She was welcomed by her brother, who showed her all this comforting love in that era, in that beautiful realm. And then she came back to this world, and she was talking with her father, and she said, but I don't understand. I don't have a brother. And her father said, well, you did. We didn't tell you about him. He died 3 months before you were born. And I remember reading that, and it really kind of struck me. And I think it was the next morning when my birth sister had sent me a picture of Betsy that I put up on my dresser in my bedroom. And it was the morning after I read that, when I was looking at her picture, and it hit me. It was like I hit a stone wall at 100 miles an hour. It just absolutely blew me away that there she was. And it was the same one who was beside me on the butterfly. And there was absolutely no question in my mind about the appearance. But of course I'd never met her. So I said, how can this be? And so then I started calling my birth parents and calling my brother and my sister. And I just kind of bring up a few more questions about Betsy, just wondering about Betsy. And everything they told me about her, it was crystal clear. That's exactly who was on the thing with me. And I can tell you that since that time, I've learned through a lot of personal, deep conscious explorations I've done with the Monroe Institute, and getting a lot deeper into what all this really means. consciousness, and had plenty of confirmation about that and about why my father wasn't there, all kinds of things. But I want to try and kind of pull this together so we'll have a little time for questions. Now, I'm a scientist, always have been, always will be, and I had to put all this together so it would somehow make some sense. All of our science measured against reality is primitive and childlike, and yet it's the most precious thing we have. I think the understanding of truth and reality is the most precious thing we have. And as much as science can take us in that direction, it too becomes very precious. Now to actually kind of get to what all is going on, and I can tell you I've struggled very hard the last 3 years plus to understand what all this really means. And you'd think, you know, as an academic neurosurgeon, I'd have a pretty good idea about consciousness and mind and brain, but what I can tell you is even in academic neurosurgery, not to mention kind of the streetwise community practice of neurosurgery, there's a whole lot about consciousness you don't have to know. We know a few ways you turn it off. We know that every day we can go in and give you general anesthetics. They're wonderful at turning off consciousness in a lot of cases. We don't have a clue how they work, but that's okay because they work. And I have many quotes kind of along the lines of this one. Eugene Wigner, a quantum physicist who is very important at kind of linking quantum physics and reality. We have at present not even the vaguest idea how to connect the physicochemical processes with a state of mind. And this is even more true today than it ever was back then. That they're really, you can follow the reductive materialist kind of model of, you know, physics, chemistry, biology, take it all the way out to brain, neuroanatomy, neurophysiology, and you hit an absolute wall. There's no one out there who can write the first sentence of how that then leads to consciousness. And I think it's important here, the linguistic brain, that little voice of reason in our heads, you know, the one that my parents put out a lot of money educating me at Duke Medical School and all that, you know, that same little voice that says, well, I'm skeptical and I don't believe this because it doesn't make sense because I know all about modern science and philosophy. That is not the consciousness I'm talking about here. It's part of it, but it's actually kind of a shield. It's put up as a fake to kind of keep you from going into what's really there. The linguistic brain is very tightly tied to the ego. The ego plays a certain role in certain things, but it really has no place in helping us get to these answers. So, in fact, that's a lot of how I use the Monroe, the hemi-sync for deep meditation, is to turn off that little voice, because I look at that linguistic brain, rational thought, as kind of the enemy. It's really an impish teen that needs to go in timeout. So this is not just human either. Don't kind of get misled by thinking, oh, well, humans are conscious because we can communicate and all this. Well, I'll tell you that it's crystal clear to me that animals, and you can debate how far down we would go on that, but animals are very conscious. In fact, in many ways, they don't have this limiting linguistic brain ego in the way. It kind of puts itself up on a pedestal, which really kind of fools you into thinking. And I can tell you that there were experiments done in neuroscience 40 years ago that showed that that little voice is a spectator. You know, don't tell it that. But it's not really the decision maker. And I don't really have time to go into that in detail. But what I'm talking about is this phenomenon of this being aware and being conscious. And a lot of any of you who are meditators, you know exactly kind of what I'm talking about. But often it can come even without meditation. Deep centering prayer, often what I call the gift of desperation. You know, I'm plenty fully aware of what can happen in people's lives in my life as a neurosurgeon and for many other reasons, that often deep desperation, being at the end of your rope, thinking you can't possibly handle one more thing, is often when. That's when you feel that touch on your shoulder and you know who is there and you know the reality of what I'm talking about. All right. So anyway, to try and bring this together, because I do want to have the time for questions. I was really stuck there, how to explain the disembodied consciousness with my scientific worldview. A lot of it has to do with kind of a discussion or debate that's been going on for at least 2,600 years. I would say you can find elements going back 4,000 years, and that's what a lot of this is about when I say this is childhood's end. But it has to do with mind and body, or brain and mind and consciousness. And it turns out that one of my favorite oxymorons is the neuroscience of consciousness, because there is none. Okay, it's an emperor's new clothes. I have to admit it, buck naked neuroscience, because there is no neuroscience of consciousness. If you open up an 1,800-page textbook on neuroscience, you'll probably find about 8 pages at the end on consciousness, and you'll see that they're kind of fuddling around. They don't have an idea what they're talking about. It really is a tremendous mistake. It's probably the only thing we know of at this point that actually is, and I think you can make an argument, I can make an argument, that it will never be known. It will never be fully understood by human brain and mind. And I think that's actually a very defensible position for various reasons. And we don't know of anything else that we can say is not ever going to be uncovered. And that's a clue that it's very close to existence, to the real core of what makes us alive. So I had to start thinking, maybe consciousness gives rise to everything else. And I will also kind of briefly comment on, well, how come we can't see that? How come our consciousness cannot see it? And it's something that my older son, Eben IV, kind of enlightened me to, an intentional veil that's there for that very purpose. It's something that was hinted at by Aldous Huxley and other writers who were doing LSD back in psychedelic drugs back in the 60s, that the doors of perception, if you could totally clean those windows of perception, which they did with psychedelic drugs, that you would see the infinity of everything, as William Blake had pointed out. I've already kind of been into this. Ego and self are very much an illusion of sorts that are very important for what we do here in this material realm, but don't start thinking that they are the secrets to understanding what's going on at the fundament of reality. And I always love this one. Albert Einstein, see, I quote a lot. I'm writing a book now, and I quote him a lot. I've got to take some of it out. But the true value of a human being is determined primarily by the measure and the sense in which he has attained liberation from the self. And that is certainly a huge part of where I think we're going with all this. As often happens, I haven't really left myself time for these slides. I told Diane before that I was whittling down. But just want to briefly touch on the quantum mechanics. Most of you probably are aware of it, some knowing a lot about it. But the only thing that you need to know, and this is the only part I'll really emphasize in my book, because my current book, although there are going to be some other books for the more discerning palate, but this one is really for the general reader. And the only thing they need to know is kind of, you can see in these kind of statements, anyone who is not shocked by quantum theory has not understood it. Niels Bohr, who was one of the founding fathers, and then of course, one of my personal favorites is a quote from Richard Feynman, who said that if someone tells you that they understand quantum mechanics, then all you've learned is that you've met a liar. And I think that kind of puts it in a nutshell, and that's really all you have to know. And the reason it was so perplexing, and these were very, very smart people, far smarter than I am, but the reason they found quantum mechanics, the results of their experiments, so totally perplexing is because they showed that consciousness and the observer determines what you see, determines reality. That there's not some reality out there. If all consciousness went away from this planet, instantly all consciousness was gone, would you just find this big dusty ball of, as if everybody just went off to the beach for the day? I don't think so. Because so much of what actually makes up reality depends on our consciousness observing it. And in fact, when you really take that to kind of a logical limit, you get to a point where you start to realize that maybe consciousness is the only thing that really exists. I mean, the modern physicists will tell you that you know, our current version of the physical world and subatomic particles and everything is very much an illusion. Quantum physics is very real. The math and the physics, you know, they make up a third of our economy. And for a long time, the physicists would say, "Oh, but you know, that's only in liquid helium near absolute zero." Well, in recent years, they've been finding more and more examples of quantum effects in biological systems, helping birds migrate, human sense of smell. DNA acts as a wonderful spintronics filter for electron spin states in quantum mechanics. I mean, there are a lot of pieces of evidence coming together now that, you know, as much as some members of the physics community would like to say, you know, that doesn't apply to this world, it actually applies very much. And in fact, I would say that, in my view, for a long time that I've been studying this, it's become crystal clear that our consciousness and awareness and mental function, mind, is absolutely a quantum effect. There's no question in my mind about it. There's a ton of evidence along those lines, especially when you start looking into what I call extended consciousness, psi phenomena, parapsychology, remote viewing, precognition, near-death experiences, sympathetic death experiences, psychokinesis. I mean, the evidence is absolutely overwhelming, and the people who tell you, no, that's all bunk, they just haven't done the homework, because it is absolutely real. And that is the part that is so kind of fundamentally exciting and earth-shattering about where all this is going. I just want to briefly point out the hard problem of consciousness, which is kind of the other kind of higher element that I want to put out in my book for the general public. It just has to do with what we all know. We're sitting here in this room. We know what it's like to be conscious. But it turns out that explaining that, what it is right now to be sitting in your chair, kind of looking at me, talking away up here, that consciousness is something that is completely beyond neuroscience and philosophy of mind to try and explain. And there are reasons why it is probably inexplicable to the human mind and human brain. That doesn't mean that we won't develop, you know, quantum computers or enhanced brains that might go out and figure it all out, but they'll never be able to explain it to us. So NDEs, near-death experiences, in a sense I look at them as kind of tip of the spear. They were definitely the tip of the spear for me, kind of opening my eyes. I guess I needed a thumping to kind of get me on board to understand what is going on with all this. And like I said, the extended consciousness, psi phenomena in general, are very important. And I don't think all the answers will lie at the root of explaining quantum mechanics, but I think the mystery of quantum mechanics, which has gotten even more vexing than it was 80 years ago when it scared Einstein and Bohr and Schrodinger and those guys, it's more mysterious now than it was then. Some of the experiments have really kind of taken us way over that deep end. And luckily the physics community is starting to get on board with that. They're starting to actually look at things like precognition and remote viewing, acknowledging that those things are very real. Any kind of extrasensory perception, psychokinesis, all that kind of thing. I think it's also very interesting with NDEs to realize the commonalities across cultures, across centuries, across continents. And in fact, a good friend of mine who I've met in this whole adventure, Ptolemy Tompkins, just wrote a book that came out on Valentine's Day. Appropriately enough, it's called The Modern Book of the Dead. And I would highly recommend it because he's got a very kind of long view of all the different cultures that have tried to put a spin on this. And the thing that's most amazing is how consistent all of this is over time. There are reasons why there are differences in near-death experiences that are, in my view, fairly simple and straightforward and have to do a lot with that filtering mechanism of the veil. I'm far more captivated by the similarities. And to me, the similarities are stunning. And I'm not just talking about NDEs, I'm talking about mystic experiences of all sorts. And of course, when I was 3 months into all this and very confused, I started reading Christian mystics and the Gnostic Gospels and some of the religious writings from 2,000 years ago, 1,500 years ago. And it was clear that these people had been same place. And the similarities are so striking. And to me, it's very easy to see that that reality of that realm is something that's been known for ages. And we've been through this period where there's been kind of, a little bit of a kind of a trick, like a snake oil salesman over the last century or two, of kind of believing that the reductive materialism and modern conventional science rules the day, and that's where truth comes from. And yet the truth that is really there has to acknowledge what's going on with consciousness, and also has to acknowledge all of these phenomena of extended consciousness that are absolutely kind of overwhelming as you go through all the information. And so what we're really trying to do is to look, to peer behind that veil. And again, forgive me for kind of moving through here, but I really, I think I've probably said most of what I need to say about this. But I think the reason for why the veil exists should be fairly obvious. It's just as Huxley and the others pointed out about psychedelic drugs, so much of that information is not needed for our basic survival as individuals here. And so in fact, a lot of that just gets in the way. One thing I found after my MDE is that I thought for a long time it's just because they were outsourcing computers to China, but I think I actually kind of cursed some of the sub-electronics I play with, and this one seems to be stubbornly not moving along. Anyway, as I was saying, for me, further investigation into this, the good news is you don't have to almost die to go there. In fact, it's wide open to all of us, but it's not something you can, order the DVDs, take the weekend course, or maybe read the good book, because in fact you have to go there yourself. But that's good news, believe me. That it's inside all of us, and it gets the technique that I happen to have bonded with here is the hemisync, and I can discuss that afterwards for anybody who's interested. But it's an audio technique that has to do with frequency mismatch to the ears that actually does a very amazing trick at the brainstem that I think undoes 500 million years of evolution. It takes us right back to vertebrates and does some amazing things to consciousness. And I can tell you that the Stargate program, remote viewing psychic spies for the U.S. military, bonded very quickly with what Bob Monroe was doing at the Monroe Institute and used it to great advantage to take that program to the next level. It's very, very powerful. And I use it a lot. In fact, I've taken their training course because I really want to help get it out there, and I think that's a very good way to do it. I was pointing out earlier, materialism, it's a hoax, and the evidence is kind of overwhelming. This is a persistent illusion that we have that this material reality is all there is, but even from the physics community, basically at best maybe they know something about 4% of what they'll admit exists. The other 96% is dark, because they're in the dark about it, they don't understand it, and that's just the beginning of the bigger mystery. Again, my apologies for moving through this, because the deep core of it all has to do with causality, free will, determinism, what is the role of the quantum mechanics, and if I hadn't lost my cursor, I'd be better off. You lost my cursor? No? Not up there. And this whole idea that consciousness might be right at the root of everything is something that's been brewing for 50 years in the physics community anyway. And I have here a quote from Sir James Jeans that I love, and I just went through very quickly. The universe begins to look more like a great thought than a great machine. Mind no longer appears to be an accidental intruder into the realm of matter. We're beginning to suspect that mind might be at the very core of all that exists. And there are other thoughts along those lines, holographic universe, John Wheeler and Von Weizsäcker, the physicists, thinking that information could be at the very basis of all that exists. In fact, the main spin I would put on that is not only is it information, but it is the one consciousness that just so happens to be an infinitely, unconditionally loving God at the very core of it all. There's my reminder. I won't go into, as I said, the evil was something that was very apparent to me in some of the lessons, and it had to do with the fact that good necessitated evil, and also the power of prayer. And I think all this has a great utility in healing, because a lot of how this is used has to do with healing. Even the remote viewers in the military had to look at this as something that was helping and healing and loving, because otherwise it doesn't work. And that's where the energy comes from, is from that healing and from that love. And I can tell you that the power of prayer definitely gets through, and that it's an important thing. That's one thing that I urge all patient families and my patients and other healthcare practitioners is to just know that the power of prayer is very real, and it gets in. And it has a lot to do with even after our loved ones have made that transition, that it gets through, and they know that you're there. And for them, when you show up 50 years later, they didn't have to wait 50 years. And they're there waiting. And that part, and it's an amazing reality. After every talk I give like this, I'll have 3 or 4 people come up and say, I've never said this to anybody. They saw something when Mom died or whatever. They come up and tell me. And I've got a wonderful story in my book about the head of a big neurosurgical program, one of the best academic programs on earth, who had a similar experience he couldn't explain at all. It involved his grandmother, who had died long before he was born, 65 years earlier, but appearing to my friend's father on his deathbed. And these stories are absolutely kind of overwhelming in their reality. Needless to say, this was very much a life-changing experience for me, and I'm very busy trying to get the book together to get it out there, to help people who have trouble with this, especially those who are stuck like I was in the reductive materialist camp, thinking that materialism is so obvious it's got to be reality. And yet it's easy to see that over the last 400 years, ever since a truce between kind of the church said, we want to take mind, the natural scientists will let you off the hook, we may not burn you at the stake this time. And since then, of course, science has gotten much more powerful. And yet, it's very much illusory to think that by not explaining our consciousness and our spiritual nature, that you're explaining reality. Because in fact, that's right at the very, very core. And that's why I've called this childhood's end. It's the fact that I think we are at the end of a long childhood with a turbulent 400-year adolescence that has to do with this materialism rearing its head and acting like it was absolutely in charge of things. And yet, that is not the reality. And so what I see coming on us now is a metamorphosis where there's a lot of momentum along these lines. What I say up here, most of it is not new. It's been written about for years. Many of the deep ideas have been around for thousands of years. But I think our culture and our world is coming to a point where the momentum is coalescing. And what will happen, and part of my goal, is to try and put science and spirituality back together again, which is where they really belong. And this involves expanding the boundaries of science more than anything. And certainly the scientific method in looking at the human brain and all will still be of value, but I know that all the answers will not be found by looking at the brain. And I also know that the much deeper and more important realities are inside each and every one of us. and it comes through conscious exploration, deep meditation, however the ways are that people get there. But there's a reality there that is far beyond what we see in the physical realm. And it's something that we all know. And we can all go there and find that. And I think as more and more of the world does that, we are going to have an amazing and wonderful awakening. So, again, my apologies for kind of racing through this, but I just wanted to thank everyone for being here, and would like to entertain any questions that people may have. Question?
Sensory deprivation chambers in relation to this your hemisphere sphere thing. Can you kind of speak to that?
Well, I think that's another way of kind of tripping up the normal kind of parade of sensory information that our mind and our brain has learned to interpret by putting in a major kind of pause. And so it's just another one of the mechanisms for uncovering and allowing some of this to manifest. But I think a lot is gained whenever we can detach from, kind of this general day-to-day world. I can tell you with the hemisync, you have very defined levels where you leave time behind, and you leave space behind, and you leave everything that you like to think of as your anchoring to reality behind. And there are other ways to do it. It's not that hemisync meditation is the only way. Transcendental meditation, deep meditation of many different sorts, centering prayer, a lot of different ways to get in there. But a lot of it is detaching from this parade of kind of ongoing cues that our brain is a very good kind of pattern recognition machine. So it looks at the current pattern and projects what's going to happen next. And if you can do something to trip that up, it helps to free you. Yes? Question?
You know what, I have a lot of the hemisync CDs. I don't know if there's one that you recommend over another one, but another question too is, I just heard recently, I think a couple days ago, that they're that close to discovering the God particle at the lab in France, the accelerator. And I wondered if, yes, sir.
Well, I'll tell you, one thing, your question about the best hemisync we can talk about. Yeah, repeating question, asking about what is the best hemisync. There's a lot of great hemisync. I'll talk about that a little later, privately with anyone who cares. And I recommend you go to the Monroe website, the Monroe Institute. Google it, you'll find it very easily. And they're just about to completely upgrade their website in a few weeks. So. But you can go there now. There's a lot of good information. Everything, this is all the God particle. This is all the God. I mean, it drives me nuts when I get calls from neuroscientists saying, temporal lobe, have you thought about superior angular gyrus? And, have you thought about this? Have you thought about that? These are all kind of epiphenomena. The God particle is, it's all catchy. It works well, in the tabloids. I would like to say the National Enquirer, but it actually works well in the New York Times and Wall Street Journal too. So, that's all a bunch of kind of hoopla. The God, fill in the blank, is inside each and every one of us. Go there. You can be part of all that. There's not going to be a God particle. There's not going to be a God part of the brain. I promise you. Yes?
Could you share, are you permitted to share some of the lessons you learned on the other side besides that evil is necessary?
It's very extensive. I mean, it filled 60 pages, and a lot of that's going to go in my book. I'll explain a lot of that. A lot of it had to do with the nature of physical reality. I mean, things like dark matter, dark energy seem to be pretty clearly explained, but then there were many, many levels of kind of physical mysteries beyond that. I'm not formally trained in physics, so I can't really get into all that. But there was a whole lot about having to do with reincarnation, having to do with the purpose of our souls. I can tell you it's all based in that love. That love is the fundamental fabric. Unconditional love is absolutely the core of everything that exists. It's the only thing that matters. And that is obviously part of what I'll get out there, but that message has been there for a very, very long time. And it's something that's repeated over and over again by people who have NDEs. In fact, there was recently a study done in Angola prison, not recently, I think it was 2 or 3 years ago, but just amazing to me how prisoners in one of the toughest prisons on earth, their NDEs have this beautiful, loving quality in the same proportions that you see in NDEs in other environments. And there's something really deep and powerful there that's independent in many ways with what we'd like to think, or certainly our preconceptions about what exists. But the short answer to your question is it's all about love. That's the point of that realm, and it's the only thing that matters. Yes?
What is the purpose of reincarnation?
I came to kind of see that reincarnation, the questions about the purpose of reincarnation. It's something that I never really thought about at all before. And since my experience, it's just become plain obvious to me that, of course, that's reality. It's the only thing that makes any kind of sense. And, I mean, I can tell you that the way I sense my NDE, I look at a room full of people like this, and what I'm seeing are all of the souls, the spirits that are here, and I know that when the physical body dies, these spirits go off, and we travel in schools, we go together, there are groups of us, we help each other, and we come back and do it again. When we're out there, I kind of liken it to schools of flying fish. And the only trick to imagining that is that the clock doesn't run by the same rules when we're down in the water. Down in the water is kind of here. This is thick molasses of, soul school. This is where the tough lessons are, evil, injustice, all of that. And then we burst up into the air together, and then we kind of go through what we have to do next because we're helping our fellow souls. And then we're back in. And that fellow soul doesn't, when that cell checks out, say your child died at 16 and 55 years later is when you're passing over. I'd be there to greet you as if it just happened. Time is totally different in that realm. But the reincarnation comes from many different angles, and there's absolutely no way I can see any of this fitting together without it. Yes?
You mentioned the melody, and I'm wondering if you've been able to recreate it, and is there a place on YouTube we can download it?
Yeah, actually, there's a site, let me get right to it, no, I'm just kidding. Very sorry to say, because when it stopped working for me, I still went through so many other things, and it didn't stick. I have a strong feeling I will be able to get to it through what I'm doing with the HemiSync. I think I'm going to get that melody back. That question comes up all the time, and I know that you all are in a group and you've kind of plans to come here and ask that question in a musical crowd. And I wish I could remember the melody, but I cannot. Other question?
I was just wondering, and I don't know if I'll be able to describe it properly. I was listening to a program, and there was a doctor on talking about trying to relate NDEs to REM sleep.
Right, there's something called REM intrusion.
Right.
And, well, I mean, in my case, it doesn't work at all because, and the same reason people will come up to me, oh, well, you had a DMT trip, we know all about that. Well, it wasn't a DMT trip, and it wasn't a REM intrusion because those things necessitate cortex to be working. If the cortex is shot, those things can't work at all. But I think, as a general principle, one might talk about it. I mean, REM intrusion has to do with some of the things that happen when we sleep and about kind of REM happening, that kind of netherworld occurring when we're kind of paralyzed, which we are with REM, so we don't get up and run around the room and do other things when we're dreaming. But it certainly doesn't apply in my case, and I think my case really supports lots of other NDE experiences. Yes?
Is your consciousness unique to you?
That's a wonderful question. It turns out that we all are one consciousness. It's all one at the core. That part's a little bit tough to put into words, but I can tell you the evidence from the remote viewing world, from the twins. I mean, my wife has older sisters who are twins. They have twin telepathy, which all twins, I think, have, and it's just back and forth all the time. They dream each other's dreams. You know that there's this incredible connection between our consciousness. In fact, there have been pretty well documented cases of people dreaming other people's dreams. There have even been crimes involving that kind of thing that were solved when people realized that, you know, that it was somebody else's dream. So at a really deep level, and I cannot pretend to be able to sit here and fully explain how that works, but I can tell you that the consciousness is the only thing that really exists, and in fact there's only one of them. And I have to leave it at that. Yes?
Does that consciousness include animals, bacteria, slugs?
Well, it does, but see, the interesting thing is once you get, I'm sorry, the question was, does that consciousness include slugs, worms? When you start reading about this, you'll find that a lot of people, physicists, scientists who are really out there will say, and subatomic particles are conscious, and pieces of space-time are conscious. And what that's telling us, when you look at it kind of the other way around, it's simply saying consciousness is the only thing that is. You know, and to sit there and pretend, oh, well, let's see, is that plant really conscious? Well, when I realized that I don't physically exist as a fundamental part of reality, just my consciousness does, it's like, oh, okay. And then it starts to make more and more sense, but you have to make that kind of leap to get there, if that makes sense.
Have you made that leap?
Yeah, that's where I went. That's where I went.
It's not our consciousness creating the reality or material reality of slugs and bacteria. Those were created by our consciousness. They're kind of co-creators with us.
Right, well, I would say the consciousness is kind of the co-creator with us. Okay? Given that none of that really exists, but the consciousness, yes, it's parceled out. You could say it exists in all of those entities, you know, all the souls, see, etc. Yes?
Did you get any information in your life's lesson about the future of the planet? And a lot of people are thinking, it's the end of the Mayan calendar, is this the end of an era, is this the end of the Earth? I tend to think it's the end of the era, but I'm wondering if you received any information on that yourself.
Question is this the end of an era? Is 2012 the end of the Mayan long calendar, December 21st, 2012, a magical day? I actually think the Mayans had a lot of knowledge. They knew time, linear time on Earth was not what it appears to be. There's a reason why all this is aimed this way. It's not apocalypse at all.